Even though that label says hierarchy, it really should say hierarchy/attribute. And then over in the filter expression, we can click the drop down the filter expression, and we can expand the all geographies and pick the country of France. So we want to see the sales by date and by product category and subcategory, but just for France. So I can check just France and click OK, and the numbers wind up, it might take a second or two, but the numbers wind up going down as a result. Now, notice, at least on mine, there was a slight delay. As I picked France, or if I uncheck France and pick Germany and click OK, there's a slight delay. Part of that delay is just the browser updating this pivot table. Sometimes it takes more time for Visual Studio here to update the data in the browser than it does to actually run the underlying query. And so I picked Germany, and I get smaller numbers. Looks like Germany only started having sales data in 2008. So I get only that data that's relevant for whatever filter I pick up here. Okay, so any questions so far? Now, notice how when I pick Germany, and I only get data for 2008, and my first question might be, well, what about 06 and 07? Well, I know from working with the data that there was no data in 06 or 07. Well, maybe just for verification, or maybe for whatever reason, I want to see the other years and any other dimensions that might be missing. I still want to see them even if I know I'm going to have nulls or blank spots. Well, by default, this cube browser only shows data for dimensions where we actually have data. But we can actually change that. There's an option in this cube browser. I can right-click on the cube browser out in the main area here, and there's an option to show empty cells. Well, if I change this to show empty cells, now I wind up getting every year, even though I've only got data in 08. So depending upon how you want to browse things, you can either right-click and turn off Show Empty Cells, or you can right-click and turn it on. It all depends upon what you're looking to see. So this is the cube browser. Now, we don't have too much more ability other than what we've already seen here. We can't save off these definitions. If we close the cube browser, for instance, if I click the window drop-down in the main Visual Studio menu and I take Close All Documents, that doesn't even ask, do I want to save my session or do I want to save my definitions? And if I go back to the cube browser, if I go back to Solution Explorer and open up that cube again and go over to the browser, I'm back to square one. So it doesn't save those settings. So in that sense, it's pretty primitive. Now we're going to use this later, and we saw an example of this already a few weeks ago. We're going to use this to do things like test roles. Notice how there's an icon in the toolbar. It's the second icon from the left under the cube tabs. It has a picture of two faces, and the icon's tooltip says Change User. We can use this to test out user roles. So if we build roles so that certain people can see certain data, we can actually browse this as if we were a user, and we'll get to that later. So that's the cube browser, and that's something that we might use after processing or after doing updates to a cube, or if we want to test out a calculation. Now on 115, they have an example of viewing the cube using Excel. Well, we might use Excel as well to test out the contents of a cube, maybe because we know that end users are going to be using Excel a lot to query data in a cube in an ad hoc fashion. So we might want to use Excel as well as part of our testing. Well, Excel provides some really nice capabilities to look at OLAP cubes. It provides the same functionality here, but admittedly can look a little bit nicer. And so we did this before, but just to do it one more time. If we want to use Excel to browse this particular database, well, we can open up Excel. So on your VM, go ahead and launch Excel. Now, most of us are using Excel 2010. A few might still have Excel 2007. Initially, the way we're going to look at an OLAP cube in Excel, there's no difference between what they did in 2010 and 2007. There are a few features that Microsoft added for browsing OLAP cubes that we'll eventually get to later. But for right now, what we're looking at, you can do in 07 as well as 2010 equally. So wait for Excel to launch here. By the way, is anybody at work or on their home computer, anybody using Excel 2010 or Office 2010 at all? Anybody using it? Evan, do you like 2010 better than 2007 or less? What's your feeling about it?
No, I do. Everything, PowerPoint, Excel, everything 2010 is a lot better.
Yeah. It took me a while to get used to 2007. I eventually liked it, but I like 2010 a lot better. So much so that I hate going back to 2007. So I'll maximize Excel, and we'll create a connection to that AdventureWorks database that we just created. So to do that in Excel, we can click the data drop down in the main menu. So in the main Excel menu, at least on mine, the 6th option in from the left, I'll click the drop down for data. And under data, in the toolbar underneath, there's an option that says from other sources. I'll click the drop down for from other sources, and I'll pick from analysis services. Now, when we do that, Excel asks, what's the server name going to be? Well, our server name is just localhost, so we can type in for the server name localhost, just one word, no spaces. And we're using Windows authentication, so no need to change that. And then we click Next. And Excel goes out, and this can take a second or two, and it looks for all the OLAP databases that have been deployed on that server. Well, if I click the drop down that says select the database, now depending upon which class you've been in, and you might see more than one OLAP database in here. For instance, we did that I1 intro SSAS database a while back, and we did the unit of measure SSAS database, and we were dealing with the unit measure conversion rates. So we probably see at least a few in here. Well, I'll pick the AdventureWorks DW2008 R2, or you can pick the 2008 if that's the only one that you have. And I actually see the modified date was 10 o'clock. That was the last time it was deployed. Now that database has 2 cubes and a bunch of perspectives. We'll look at perspectives a little bit later. A perspective is like a whittled down version of a cube. Maybe if you've got people who only want to look at a few or maybe just 1 or 2 fact tables. A perspective is a simplified version of a cube. But we'll pick the main AdventureWorks cube, which is the first one on the list here, and then click Next. And you can actually save this off, where it says Save Data Connection File and Finish. At the top, there's a file name, and it has an ODC extension. ODC stands for Office Data Connection File. It's a connection string that's based upon the settings that we just made here in these previous screens, and it's saved off as an XML file. So if we want to give this a better file name and put it off the root of our C drive, I could actually change this file name to just c:\adw.odc if I just want to keep a very simple name for it. And that way, if I want to go connect to the same AdventureWorks OLAP database later, I wouldn't have to go through these steps again. I could just simply point to that ODC file. So I'll click Finish, and I already have one out there of that name, so I'll overwrite it. And then it asks, what do we want to create? Do we want to create a pivot table or a pivot table and a pivot chart? What do we want to do here? Well, we'll just start with a basic pivot table and click OK. And what we get in Excel, and this is again is something that end users are going to utilize, but it's important to understand the things that users can get done in Excel. Over on the right-hand side, we get the pivot table field list. Now, by the way, at some point, you'll do some navigating, you'll do some clicking around in Excel, and you'll lose that pivot table field list. Like, for instance, if I click out in no man's land here, that pivot table field list goes away, and people wonder, how do I get it back? Well, all you have to do is click back over in the pivot table on the left, and then the pivot table field list comes back. So if you click out in the middle and lose the pivot table field list, just click back in the pivot table, and the list comes back up. Well, what happens if you accidentally close it? I'll click the X button to close the pivot table field list. Well, now, if I click out in no man's land and click back in the pivot table, it doesn't come back. So, did I really mess myself up? Well, no. What we can do if you close the pivot table field list, if you actually close that window pane, what we can do is go to the menu option at the top, and I'm actually having a slight brain malfunction here. Oh, okay. If you lose the pivot table field option because you closed it, what you can do to get it back is, first of all, click in the pivot table itself. Well, that will display two additional drop downs over the right hand side, and one of them is options. So again, if you close that pivot table field list, click back in the pivot table, and then click on options at the top, and there's an icon in the toolbar for field list. We can actually click that to bring it back. So if you accidentally close the pivot table field list, click back in the pivot table, go up to the options drop down and click the field list over on the right, and you've got it back. Now the pivot table field list shows at the top all the different fact tables. Well, we've got fact exchange rates, fact financial reporting, fact internet sales, fact reseller orders, even though it's just a one measure fact table, fact reseller sales. That's a lot of fact tables. And maybe we only want to look at one of them. Well, what we can do, there's a drop down that says show fields related to. We can click the drop down and change that from all and pick one of the measure groups. So I'll pick reseller sales. Well, now the list of items down at the bottom down below is a little bit shorter. We get just the reseller sales measures, and the dimensions below are only the ones that are related to reseller sales. So after picking just reseller sales in this drop down, if I scroll down further and I try to look for the dimension called customer, it's not in here because reseller sales is not tied to customer. So even if you have an OLAP database or a cube with many fact tables, if you're only interested in looking at one and you only want to see the related dimensions, we can pick that fact table, and then down below we get only the dimensions that are associated with it. And so we can start to select measures. So I can, from the reseller sales fact table, I can go down to the measure called reseller sales amount, check that, and over on the left-hand side we get the 80 million, and I'll check one other one. I'll pick the internet, or excuse me, the reseller gross profit. Check that, and the gross profit is $470,000. So obviously not much in the way of profit compared to the revenue. And then I'll scroll down and look at some of the dimensions. So I'll scroll down to date, and I'll expand the fiscal definition, and I see the date.fiscal hierarchy. Again, they really need to name it something like tree or hierarchy to make it obvious what it is. Well, I'll take that one and I'll put that into the row area. But what I can do is I can click on date.fiscal. I'm not going to click the checkbox. I can just simply click on date.fiscal and then drag it down to the bottom of this pivot table field list where it says row labels, down in the row label quadrant. Well, if I let go of the mouse, well, now I get the breakout of years and half years and quarters and months